Words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question, and I give the call to member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's a great privilege to be able to speak on the National Consumer Credit Protection Amendment in focusing on Australia's restricting lending legislation and why we need to drive reform to enable Australians to be able to go to a bank and get money. And that's ultimately what this legislation is actually about, is enabling Australians to actually access credit. Because restrictive lending laws that deliberately seek to deny or limit people being able to access credit doesn't hurt the top end of town. Truthfully, it actually favours them because they just get to sit there in their cushy jobs, guaranteed that there's no real risk, and just take the cream off the top. It doesn't hurt the rich either. It's not as they've got a problem with access to credit most of the time because they've got the assets to back it up, so to have the security so that people can borrow the cash and get access to money. They're a safe bet. These laws, restrictive lending legislation, harms the poor, harms the people on low incomes. It harms the small businesses that want to grow. They harm people who don't have security. Now, we all understand there's got to be proportional risk around security as part of a process of lending. But these laws needlessly make it harder and create extra hurdles and barriers to the young, to the low income, to those that want to get ahead and take risks so that they actually might have their opportunity too. Is it really a shock that since we've introduced restrictive lending laws that we've seen a massive growth in demand and credit from non-bank lenders? Is it really a shock that it's become harder and harder for people who live off their salary who don't have assets to access credit? Frankly, these laws are farcical in their operation today. I'll give you an example, and I'm going to use a personal one. The other day I went to get an increase on my credit card limit, and it was politely 2/5 of nothing, and I had to fill out 30 pages and wait 3 weeks. Now, I'm fine. I can handle it. It's just more annoying than anything else. But for some people who need access to credit to support their circumstances straight away, secured or unsecured, it could be the difference between whether they can provide finance for their business or not. It can be the difference between whether they're able to access a purchased property or not, a home or not. And so the absurdity that we hear from the Shadow Treasurer and others railing against it because they're the champions of the poor. They're the ones trying to keep the poor in their place. We are trying to lift them up and give them opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet. Because that's the essence of what liberalism is about. Empowering individuals and families and communities is the foundation for the success of our country. Not trying to keep people in their place to maintain our political relevance, as those in the opposition benches do. The poor are the ones that are hurt most by the current legislation, and that's why the reform is so central. But the scary thing is it doesn't even always help. Just the poor. Sometimes even the asset-rich are hit by it. Restrictive lending laws. The number of SMSF holders, self-managed superannuation fund holders, who are out of the formal workforce, who get income through dividends off their assets now, and can't go to the bank to borrow money. It's just absurd. People with millions of dollars of assets, rivers of revenue through dividends as the basis of their income, and can't go to the bank and borrow money, whether it's for themselves to purchase another asset, whether it's to help their children to be able to buy their first home, whatever it is. Restricted lending means they can't get cash. And for what? for the vanity of the opposition because they introduced a Northern American solution to a Northern American problem since the global financial crisis and won't accept they actually just got it wrong. Their legislation doesn't help Australia. It isn't solving an Australian problem. They have created a problem out of nothing, but to the detriment of those, except for those with high incomes, high assets, who are still in the workforce. Creates needless piles of regulation and processing and capital going towards creating jobs for regulatory compliance for nothing. But the truth is, it's not just for nothing. Because the people being hurt by it are those people who want to get ahead, where it's harder and harder for first home buyers to get a loan, where it's harder for women who found themselves divorced to get a loan to buy a home. And this fits into a very long pattern of behaviour that we now see from the Australian Labor Party. We know with their prioritisation of superannuation over home ownership, they're throwing young Australians to the curb, their dream and their aspiration to own their own homes. To those people who find themselves going through significant life events such as divorce in their 40s or their 50s, particularly women, whose biggest leading impact on their retirement security is whether they're able to get into home ownership before they retire with enough time to retire the debt of a mortgage, are being told by the Australian Labor Party, the Labor opposition and their mates in the super sector who want to cream those same people's superannuation for their own profits, their bonuses. No. We know what's best for you. The Labor Party doesn't care about their concerns or their interests because at the heart of their political agenda is a patronising worldview that they have better judgment than people who can stand on their own 2 feet. They would rather older women have their superannuation eaten away by rent than for them to be able to enjoy the benefits of home ownership, to keep them poor. And that is the legacy. It may not be their intent, but it is most certainly the outcome. And we see this consistently in their constant effort to prioritise superannuation and their fund manager mates, to prioritise their fund manager mates' bonuses over the aspiration, the dreams, the opportunity and the empowerment of Australians and their families. And it's disgusting. This is disgusting. They run interference when we raise and highlight fees for no service charged by industry funds. Why? Because of their political proximity to them. Because their alliances and their interests and their taking of donations and fees and support from exactly the same funds. On this side of the chamber, we make no apology. We are in favour of empowering Australians and their families. We want them to be able to stand up and own their own home. It is the foundation of their security, it is the foundation of their opportunity, and it is the foundation of their success in life. That's why I am proud to stand for Home First, Super Second and make no apology about it, because what it will do is provide an opportunity for tens of thousands, if not millions of Australians to have a better working life, a more prosperous working life, to put them in a better position to save for their retirement than the alternative.
Can I just interrupt the member for a moment and just draw him back to the topic of the bill? I understand he was talking about super in the context of credit availability, but I do ask that he now come back to the topic of the bill.
Thank you, Speaker. And there is absolutely a congruence between access to credit, home ownership, superannuation and priorities in life, and the principles that sit behind them around empowerment for individuals and families. And that's why these issues have such a relationship. The Shadow Treasurer spoke specifically about home ownership and access to credit and being able to borrow from the bank and home ownership. and access to other forms of capital are critical as part of that story too. And the dishonesty from the Labor members who oppose this removal of restrictive lending regulation and legislation is a fundamental misunderstanding of how credit is available. You just need to listen to the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Governor who appears before the Economics Committee, and I see a member, the former Deputy Chair of the Economics Committee in the chamber right now. He knows that when the Reserve Bank Governor comes before the committee, he tells us exactly his attitude towards economic conditions, economic circumstances and the issues before him. And throughout last year, every time the Reserve Bank Governor came before our committee, he spoke and was asked questions about Australia's restrictive lending laws. And what he said was that the guidance notes that were being issued by the regulators were directly hampering the capacity for people to be able to access credit. More critically, the removal of restrictive lending laws would not lead to the ridiculous circumstances boasted by those on the opposition benches. But the macroprudential framework that's in place through the regulators would ensure that lending was appropriate. But what we wouldn't have is needless paperwork, needless delay to yes, needless situation where young Australians who want to buy their first home miss out because the law gets in their way. And what we want to do is make sure not just that the law protects consumers, but empowers them. And that's why empowerment through home ownership is so critical. But under our current laws, not just in restrictive lending, but in other areas like the prioritisation of superannuation over home ownership, we see the empowerment of capital at the expense of the consumer, at the expense of the citizen. And that any member could sit in this place and say they're going to put capital before citizens and their empowerment. You have to start to question, who is it they're here to represent? Because it's only citizens that vote for them, and they vote for them to come in this place to stand up for them, their community, their family, their country. So that's why I support this provision, this legislation, Deputy Speaker. Because the pattern of behaviour from our opponents has been to stand up for capital at the expense of citizens. We on this side of the chamber are in favour of laws that empower citizens over capital. And I hear some protests from members opposite, like the member for Kingston Smith, who should know better, which is around making sure that young Australians, new Australians, low-income Australians can have their opportunity at the Australian dream too. That's why the current laws don't work. That's why the current laws don't protect people, but pity them. And our focus is what we need to do to mobilise people, individuals, families, communities and country to be successful. Because that's what we want to empower. Every Australian's chance at their own success. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.